Okay, so tonight I will finish up. Next week, Josh will be teaching. I believe he's going to cover Philemon, which is one of Paul's prison epistles, which we'll talk a little bit about tonight. But we've got two journeys of Paul to cover here in one evening, so buckle up. One is his journey to Rome, and that's about 1,400 miles. Here is the journey in short, and he will start out in Jerusalem. That's where the mob will get upset with him and try and kill him. Claudius Lysias, who's the centurion, will save his life, eventually catch that there's a conspiracy, bring him to Caesarea, and then he will stand trial and eventually get to the point where it's clear that he's not going to get a fair trial. And so after 2 years of waiting for a decent opportunity to be released, because there's no legitimate charge brought against him, and in fact, each of the governors recognize that along the way, eventually he appeals to Caesar. And so he will, that right to appeal to Caesar means that he will go to Rome, he will be delivered there for trial when Caesar has time for it, which is why you don't just appeal to Caesar, because you know you're going to be waiting. And if you're Paul, you've already been waiting 2 years. It's really, that's a big trigger to pull. You can't unring that bell. And so he will board a ship. They will take him up around the northern edge of the island of Cyprus. And very quickly, as he's traveling there, it becomes clear that the weather is not good. Down in chapter 27, down verse 9, after they boarded another ship, a larger vessel, it says, when considerable time had passed, so chapter 27, verse 9, and the voyage was now dangerous since even the fast was already over, Paul began to admonish them. So that verse 9 gives us a little bit of time context to what time of the year. Because it says the fast had already passed. That's a reference to the Day of Atonement, which means you're probably about October. You're in the late September or October time period at that point. So the weather's turning. This is not a good time to be sailing. There's no definitive way to know why it is that the captain of the ship is pushing to continue to travel. We can make some guesses, but that's the best that we can do. One of the guesses is simply this, that the longer his cargo sits, the longer he has to wait to get paid. And so if you are the captain of a ship, you make money when you deliver goods. If you are not delivering goods, then you don't make money. And the debate that's going over right now is, do we wait an entire season until all the bad weather has passed and we sit in harbor here, which means he's got a ship full of goods, a ship full of people that this captain would have to deal with. So in chapter 27, the captain persuades the commander, the centurion, in verse 11, that it's appropriate to move forward. Even though Paul is saying, don't do it, and they head out, and eventually what ends up happening is they get caught in the very storm that Paul was concerned would be the issue. And so verse 13, they set out with a moderate south wind, but verse 14, before very long, there rushed from the land a violent wind called the Urquilo. And so there's this... They get caught in the storm, and that's where you get on the map that really big squiggly line, because we really just don't know where they are. We just know that they are lost out at sea, lost in the storm. And things get very dangerous along the way. One of the issues they have to deal with are these kind of the shallows of Syrtis that is mentioned in verse 17, which are a moving underwater sand dunes is I guess the way you think of it. If you've ever kind of seen sand dunes even out in the Sahara, you see National Geographic or anything, and you see how those sand dunes will move with the wind. There are these sand dunes, but underneath the water, that will create ever-moving shallow spots in the sea, and you don't know when they'll come up. And when your ship is being driven along by the wind and you can't control where you go and take it slow, the risk of running aground becomes a very dangerous thing, because now all of a sudden you've run aground, but you're in the middle of nowhere. And that ship is probably never going to make it out, and so you die. That's what happens on the shallows of Syrtis. So they do several things at this point. They let down the sea anchor. The sea anchor is not a normal anchor. They look essentially like a parachute. If you've ever seen drag racing, right, where they shoot the parachute at the end, a sea anchor has the same idea. We're not trying to stop the ship, but we're just trying to slow it down. And then they also are trying to remove the weight of the ship. So in verse 18, they jettison the cargo. So if the captain's goal was to get the cargo sold, now you don't have the cargo to sell. So it didn't really work out. Again, we don't know exactly why the captain thought, maybe he's just a daredevil. And maybe he'd made that trip before and it had worked out. Certainly all of us can think of times where that's happened. I've been driving in the snow before and said, it's no big deal, and then had to call a friend a half hour later to pull me out of a ditch. It didn't help that when I called in the middle of the night, he picked up immediately and said, I knew you'd be calling. That didn't help one whit. So I've been the captain, so not too much judgment there. But they will release that cargo. They set out the sea anchor down in verse 20. Since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing us. This is that typical kind of understatement that you'll find in Luke's writings in particular. There's no small storm, which means it's a very big storm, was assailing us. From then on, all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned. So they're now out in the middle of the sea, and it's becoming more and more clear that this is not going to work out. There's no earthly reason for us to live. And so it is at that time that Paul will speak up in verse 21. Men, you ought to have followed my advice and not to have set sail from Crete and incurred this damage and loss. For the record, this is proof that there are times it's okay to say, I told you so. Because that's what Paul does. He says, I told you so, right? You should have listened to me. Now, without knowing for certain what are some or one good reason why Paul might be telling them, I told you so. What's the value to Paul saying, hey, I gave you this advice and I was right and you were wrong? Typically that's kind of rude. It's salt in the wound when you're all about to die. Yeah, one element to this, right, is that he's reminding them of the fact that he does kind of know what he's talking about here, right? Remember, I was the lone voice who said, don't go. And the next thing he's going to say is going to require them to trust him. So I think that is an aspect to it. And so in verse 22, he says, yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood before me. Don't have time to go into the beauty of that phrase, but the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, I think is a beautiful phrase. Saying, do not be afraid, Paul, you must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. Therefore keep up your courage, men, for I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on a certain island. Several different things to think about at this point that just come out of that very short set of statements from Paul. One, previously before Paul spoke, how much hope did the people have? None. The scripture says that all hope had been abandoned, right? There's no hope. Now Paul is saying, remember I was right and you were wrong. I'm asking you to have hope. I want you to take courage. And he tells them why to take courage, because of God. And Paul himself will even say that, I believe God. Everything that Paul is saying, even in this dark moment, is about leading people towards faith. And it's an interesting aspect of Paul's character that it's like he never lets off the gas of being evangelistic. Here we are, we're in the middle of the sea, everybody just wants to live, and he's still saying, look, here's an opportunity for me to teach them. Believe God. I believe God, and it's going to work out that way. Yeah. Yep. No way to steer the ship anymore. Yep. No, you're absolutely right. It reminds me of Gideon, when Gideon went to battle, and God goes through this whole thing of removing warriors and just saying, like, send these people home and send these people home. And his reason is, he says, when you go to battle, I don't want you to go battle with a big army so everybody thinks, oh, they won the battle because Gideon had this large army. I want them to think the only way they won that battle was because of God. This is the same principle, right? You remove all of the things. You say, oh, well, we made the tactical move to jettison the cargo, and now we're safe. I think you've got a huge point there. God waits until all hope is gone to provide heavenly hope. And there may be some life lessons for us there if you kind of start thinking about it and how life sometimes gets hard and you get scared and anxious, and maybe why doesn't God just fix your problem immediately? I won't mention that, but just hypothetically, right? Yeah. Yeah, God says he doesn't despise a broken and contrite heart, right? These are broken people at this point. They are at the very bottom. And so, yeah, as you progress through, Paul lays that out. Another small detail that we sometimes skim over is he says, behold, God, the angel tells Paul, behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. If you're granted something, what does that mean you did for it? You asked for it. You wanted it. Right? If you are granted something, there was a request there. And so what we find out is, without Paul saying it, what Paul's been doing this whole time is he's been praying that God would not just save him, but save this crew. Now, and Dan brings up a good point. Paul had known he's going to go to Rome. But does that mean all of these people on this ship are going to go to Rome? There's no guarantee that they will live. Paul's been praying for them, and this angel says God's granted you their lives. If you ever doubt whether the prayers of righteous people matter, this is a great example of it. There are 276 souls on that ship, so 275 of them are saved because of the prayers of Paul. So just, think of that in terms of your own life, right? And it's also evidence for us that praying for people who are not Christians is perfectly allowed. Right? And encourage. It's a biblical model that Christians should pray for people who are not just Christians, but also those who are, not just those who are Christians, but those who are not Christians too. See if I can get a sentence right. Any other thoughts or comments before we move forward? Okay, well, they end up running aground on the land, the island of Malta, and as they land there, it is a tiny little island. If you look at Sicily up there, Malta's this little place on the other side of it. It's rather tropical and nice and lovely. If you want more details, talk to Dr. Tim. He has been there, and it's lovely, isn't it? It's a very nice place, yeah, especially if you've been almost dead at sea. So you move from one to a tropical paradise, and it says the natives were extraordinarily kind to them. There's only one kind of fly in the ointment with the whole thing. They're setting a fire up on the beach, and what happens to Paul? Yeah, he gets bit by a snake while he's gathering wood. And so everybody goes, oh, no, this guy's going to die. And it's interesting, you're kind of back to this same thing that we talked about with on the ship. Wow, all the hope is lost. This guy's bitten by a venomous viper. The people on the island would have all known about these vipers, and in fact, it says they're watching him. They're kind of just like morbidly watching him, waiting for him to croak. And because they know how this goes. You get bit by that viper, you die. And then he lives, and it becomes another testament to God. So these become these miraculous events that are supposed to point people to believing in God. Does everybody who sees these events end up believing in God? No. Turns out miracles do not convert you. Right? It is, if you do not have that honest heart, of which some of the people on this island do, but others do not, it's not going to be enough. But if you were honestly paying attention to the events that surrounded all of this, this would have been a earth-shattering set of events. To live on that island, and most of those people probably lived on that island their whole life. A viper bites, you know how it goes, right? You just go, oh, did you hear about, John? He got bit by a viper, and everybody's, you don't even have to hear the rest of the story. Oh, I feel so bad for his family, right? Because you know how it plays out. For Paul to survive this is something that gets them thinking, and some of them come to the conclusion of verse 6. They change their minds, and what do they begin to say? They say he's a god. Okay, so they come to the wrong conclusion. So Paul's going to do his best to deal with that, but this is a typical sort of problem. The miracles in and of themselves are not necessarily, they aren't enough to convert. You need truth. And so Paul will end up preaching, doing a lot of good there, end up healing a man who, in verse 7, it says, and the neighbor of that place were lands belonging to the leading man of the island. That's an interesting title, leading man of the island. For a long time, archaeologists thought that's not a real title. That just meant he was a big shot. Well, they've actually found evidence in archaeology on the island of Malta that, guess what one of the titles was for somebody who's like a governor or in charge? Called him the leading man. So this is, Luke again is being quite accurate with the things that he says. Well, his father is sick. Paul ends up healing him, and all goes well, and then they eventually set sail at the end of 3 months. So they set sail on an Alexandrian ship, which looked something like this, which had the twin brothers on its figurehead, which they looked something like this. And then from there, they will head up north, past Sicily and beyond, all the way up until eventually they end at Rome. And so as they're traveling on their way to Rome, Paul will run into Christians along the way. Paul is not the first Christian to Rome. If you go all the way back to the beginning of Acts, and it talks about all the different languages that were spoken and the different places that people were from, one of the places that Acts chapter 2 mentions people were from on the day of Pentecost was Rome. So they would have gone back there. And we've already know some other people who had been in Rome before, Priscilla and Aquila. And so Paul's not the first Christian there, but the brethren, when they hear about him, they come out of the woodwork. And it says in verse 15, when Paul saw them, he thanked God and he took courage. Beautiful picture there of what brotherly love can do, right? Paul's been through so much, and how powerful it was to see fellow Christians. So Paul then continues traveling, eventually gets himself to Rome, and then there's a few events that happen there as we close out that journey. Does anybody have any comments or thoughts or anything like that before we move to Rome itself. Yeah. Yeah, Paul's not getting weekly email updates, right, on each of these congregations. The work is continuing, and it's interesting. You go all the way back to Paul and Barnabas' journey where they visit all the churches, and then as they're heading back, it says they appointed elders in every church, and they commended them to the Lord in whom they had believed. In other words, here you now have elders, you have the proper biblical structure. It's between you and God. And they survived. I mean, congregations are successful. It's a beautiful example of how, even in the apostolic age, it wasn't like the apostles were always micromanaging all of the events in every congregation. They're succeeding and flourishing with rare contact with apostolic teaching, right? I mean, they're getting letters and whatnot, but a lot of it is just people doing their best with what they have and moving forward. And in that sense, we're really no different, right? Any other thoughts or comments? Okay, so Paul will travel into Rome, and the road marker here is the Via Appia, or the Appian Way. It's a road, a very famous road that still exists in Rome, the Appian Road. If Jeremy DeHutt was here, he's a part of Appian Media. That's where they get their name from, is the road to Rome. Paul is going to travel that road. It's one of those kind of cool places that you can look at and travel and visit today and walk on and say, with a pretty high level of certainty, Paul's been somewhere on this road. You can pin him down to that specific. And so he enters Rome. While he is in Rome, Paul will be in prison. The end of chapter 28 contains essentially two things. Starting in verse 23, Paul will have a meeting with as many of the Jews who want to come. It turns out they didn't know a lot about Paul, which kind of surprised Paul, considering the amount of kerfuffle that had been caused in and around Jerusalem. It had not made its way to the Jewish, the Roman Jews. But they did know about Christianity, and they wanted to hear more about it. And as they say in verse 22, it's known to us that it is spoken against everywhere. And so Paul tells them. So they gather on a certain day. He tells them all about it. And by and large, they're not interested. That's the general gist of that gathering of people to hear Paul preach, is that they're not interested. Paul will then quote Isaiah and say, look, you're just what Isaiah said. You're hearing but not listening. Jesus himself would often say, having eyes to see but they don't see, and having ears to hear but they don't hear. He's quoting that same idea, that these are people who are not paying attention. And so in verse 28 it says, therefore let it be known to you that this salvation of God has been sent to the Gentiles. They will also listen. And when he's spoken these words, the Jews departed, having a great dispute amongst themselves. So Paul shows up in Rome and immediately throws the Jewish community into turmoil, which is pretty classic Paul, right? But a difference is, typically when the Jews got really, really mad, what's their plan? What do they do when they get jealous of Paul? They don't like him preaching to Gentiles. How do they handle it? Yeah, they'll riot and they'll kick him out of town, right? Except you can't do that now because he's here to see Caesar and he's under Roman guard. So now they have this like new problem. Paul is actually going to spend 2 years in Rome in his own rented quarters. And it says in verse 30, welcoming all who came to him, preaching the kingdom of God and teaching concerning the Lord Jesus Christ with all openness unhindered. I often read that passage and wonder how much of a freedom Paul felt in an ironically not free position, right? He's in prison, but he's now able to openly and in an unhindered way preach Jesus Christ to the largest, most powerful city in the empire because he's in the witness protection program. That's what he's in, right? Like, they can't get mad and stone him and drive him out of town. He's in his own rented quarters, but he's under guard. And so he's able to continue to preach the word unhindered to whoever wants to come. And so Paul can't move. He's kind of stuck where he is, but open door policy. And so the gospel spreads in Rome while Paul is in prison. And I just love the imagination of God, because if you were to ask me, how would you make it so that Paul would have freedom to preach to as many people in Rome as possible? I wouldn't say put him in prison. But that's exactly what God does. He puts him in prison, and that allows him to preach the gospel openly and unhindered while he's awaiting trial. And you'll notice, how long does he wait for trial? 2 more years. So it's 2 years in Caesarea before he says, this kangaroo court ain't working. Then the trip, shipwreck and all, and then 2 years beyond that. And you'll notice the book of Acts doesn't really end. It just kind of leaves you hanging, doesn't it? Because the story of Acts is the acts of the Holy Spirit in creating and establishing the church. And guess what story's not done? Still doing it. The Holy Spirit is still establishing the church, still spreading the word. He's doing it here in Eastland. He's doing it around the globe. His work is still continuing. And I love the idea that Acts doesn't have an ending, because we're not at the ending, right? And we don't even know from the book of Acts the end of Paul's story. We know he's awaiting trial, but again, if you were to write a story about Paul, what would you want to find out? He appealed to Caesar, and what happened? Like, what did Caesar say? How did it turn out? We can find that answer, but not in Acts. So, now we're going to pivot to what I call Acts 29. Because if you notice, we're in Acts chapter 28, and it leaves you hanging, but there are some other events. One of those events is the fact that during that time that Paul was in Roman imprisonment, awaiting trial, he wrote what are typically referred to as the prison epistles or prison letters. Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. These are the letters that Paul wrote to different congregations or individuals, in the case of Philemon, during his time of his first Roman imprisonment. I call it the first Roman imprisonment because we'll find out through context and some of Paul's other writings that he, in fact, does get out of this. He appeals to Caesar. Caesar is Nero at this time. Nero is not a good guy. I believe that came up in one of our previous classes. Not a good guy, but you could break Nero's reign into 2 distinct time periods. Nero the crazy, who was under control because he was young enough that he had 2 advisors that kind of ran the nation for him. Nero's still a petulant child who's corrupt and perverted, and I use that term in a very proper sense. That's the first half. The second half is Nero gets older, kills those 2 advisors, and then runs amok. This trial happens during that first time period, before Nero becomes the Nero who just openly kills Christians. So, Paul will eventually be freed from this first imprisonment. After that first imprisonment, he's going to write 1 Timothy and Titus. He's traveling. And then his final letter will be 2 Timothy. and that will be during his second imprisonment, his final imprisonment, and it is Paul's death letter. And when you read it with that context, it changes the way you read it. It is the final letter that we have that he wrote, and he wrote it to the man that he considered like a child, a son of his, Timothy. So these are the prison epistles, the letters after that, 1 Timothy and Titus, and then during the second imprisonment, the 2 Timothy. Any have any comments or questions or anything like that? Okay, map time. So what I'm going to show you is Acts 29, but if you ask me, Scott, how do you know he visited these places for sure and in this order? I am going to immediately cry, I didn't say I knew it for sure. I'm giving you my best guess of putting the information together, and if you want to draw the map a little differently, I won't fight you. But we have some data from Paul's letters that helps us to put together what I think is a pretty decent picture of his time between the first imprisonment, where he appeals to Caesar and is let free, and the second imprisonment, where he will eventually die. So he starts off in Rome, right, where he's been awaiting trial. Trial gets over. He ends up leaving Rome. Acts 28, verse 30, tells you he was there 2 years. And then I'm going to say he goes to Crete. Why do I choose Crete versus some of the other places? Because I want to make the thing kind of look like a giant circuit. Because when Paul takes journeys, how does he typically make them look? Giant circuit. So I'm going to try and do that too. But the reason I say he goes to Crete is because when he writes to Titus, he says, for this reason I left you in Crete, that you should set in order the things that are lacking and appoint elders in every city as I commanded you. When he says, I left you in Crete, what does that make it sound like Paul did? He went to Crete. Right, yeah, so he had to go there. So Paul then goes to Crete and leaves behind Titus to appoint elders. In the book of Titus, one of the primary subjects in the book of Titus is qualifications for elders. Then, Miletus. 2 Timothy chapter 4, Paul's final letter. He says, Erastus stayed in Corinth, but Trophimus I have left in Miletus sick. Makes it sound like he himself went to Miletus at one point. Then, Macedonia. Paul, this is where Philippi is, Thessalonica, all of these places he's been to before, Berea. 1 Timothy chapter 1, he says, as I urge you when I went into Macedonia. So I have this picture of he goes to Miletus, and from Miletus goes up to Macedonia. He tells Timothy, remain in Ephesus that you may charge some that they teach no other doctrine. So Paul will send Timothy to Ephesus. Now this is a pattern we see all the time in Paul's journeys, right? Paul's going places, but what's he doing at the same time he's going? He's sending people left and right, leaving them behind, saying, I got to keep going, but you stay put and you do some teaching. That's what he does with Titus. That's what he does with Timothy. Timothy, he's going to have him, again, with the qualifications for elders. He's going to cover that there in Ephesus. It doesn't say that Paul went to Ephesus. Maybe he did. When he says remain in Ephesus, maybe Paul stopped off in Ephesus too. Do we know it? No. So I just say he sent Timothy to Ephesus. Maybe he went there with him first. Not sure. Okay. From Macedonia, he goes to Troas. Now, if you want to debate me, did he go from Miletus to Troas, then Macedonia, or did he go to Miletus to Macedonia and then to Troas? Which one is it? I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. But Troas, 2 Timothy 4, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas when you come, and the books, especially the parchment. So here, Paul at some point had been in Troas and had left some stuff behind, and he tells Timothy, when you come to visit me, bring those things. Then from there, Corinth, 2 Timothy 4:20 again. Erastus stayed in Corinth, but Trophimus I left in Miletus sick. Makes it sound like he had left Trophimus in Miletus, but he had left Erastus in Corinth. Now, do we know that for sure? No. Just emphasizing, this is all putting the pieces together to the best of our ability, but that is Paul's pattern. He goes to places and then he tells people to stay behind while he moves on. And then Nicopolis, Titus 3, when I send Artemis to you or Tychicus, be diligent to come to me at Nicopolis, for I've decided to spend the winter there. Here, as Paul writes Titus, it says, I decided to spend the winter in Nicopolis. That either means he's in Nicopolis right then, or that's his plan. Well, if it's his plan to stay in Nicopolis, does that mean Paul will actually get to be there? Did Paul ever plan to go places that he did never actually get to go? It happens all the time, right? So we're doing the best we can, but what you're seeing is another journey of Paul. This is Paul's final journey. Whatever that map looks like, right? However we connect those dots, maybe some of the dots aren't there. Maybe they're in different orders. Maybe Crete's the last place he goes and Macedonia is the first. Doesn't matter. Your salvation is not dependent on this map. It better not be. But what I want you to see is a pattern of Paul doing what Paul's always done. He gets out of jail. After 4 years waiting for his trial, he gets free. And what does he go back to doing? Right away. Foot on the gas. He's preaching the gospel. And he gets the crew together, gets the band back together, and says, you stay here, I'm going on. You stay here, you go over there. And he's making sure that the work is done. And then from Nicopolis, we take him all the way back to Rome, where he will end up being there in chains. And you'll notice in 2 Timothy 1:16, that's what he'll say, is it's a different kind of arrest in this second imprisonment. The Lord grant mercy to the household of Onesiphorus, for he often refreshed me and was not ashamed of my chain. But when he arrived in Rome, he sought me out very zealously and found me. At the end of Acts 28, he's staying in his own rented quarters. Is he under arrest? Yes. He's awaiting trial, but it's a generally pretty good circumstance, right? He's preaching the gospel open and unhindered. Anybody wants to come, he can preach to. There's no mention of chains or anything like that. But 2 Timothy is a different story. Paul will describe his situation in 2 Timothy as a very difficult one, where he is in prison, awaiting trial, expecting to die. Everything about his circumstances makes you think that he's not going to get out. I mean, you think about it. If you're awaiting trial and the judge has already said, you can stay in your own house. We'll get to you when we do. Maybe we'll put a guard out front. He's fine. Let people go visit him. It's fine. Kind of gives you a sense you might just make it out. But if, on the other hand, while you're awaiting trial, they stick you in a giant hole and they shackle you with chains, and people have to go look and zealously search to find you, kind of makes you think it's going to turn out a little different. And that's the case with 2 Timothy. Eusebius, in his what's referred to as ecclesiastical history, so this is not biblical history, so we do not know definitively, but this is earlier writing. It's 312 AD, something like that. So it's a couple of hundred years later, but still not thousands of years later, or something like that. Eusebius will write, it is therefore recorded that Paul was beheaded in Rome itself, and that Peter likewise was crucified under Nero. Right? So this would be the second half, the crazy half of Nero's reign. This account of Peter and Paul is substantiated by the fact that their names are preserved in the cemeteries of that place even to the present day. That's not our present day. That's that present day. So at that time in which he's writing this history, he says, yeah, I could still go and find you the grave of Peter and the grave of Paul, which is kind of a fascinating thing to think about, that they knew. So yeah, they're preserved in our cemeteries. So there's good reason to believe, even though it's not. Look, there's lots of history you believe that isn't the Bible, right? And you probably took history in school, and they probably taught you some things, and you said, oh, okay, that sounds good. This is probably the case, too, that there's plenty of good reason to buy into this history that Paul was beheaded. Now, Paul's beheaded and Peter's crucified. Anybody know why? Why is Peter crucified and Paul beheaded? Most likely. Peter's not a Roman citizen. Yeah, you can't crucify Roman citizens. You can non-citizens. So Peter could be crucified. History says that he asked to be crucified upside down, so it wasn't exactly the same as his Lord. And again, this is extra biblical history, but really no reason to doubt it. But Paul is beheaded. Actually, some of the records say he was beheaded outside of the city on the Appian Road. Again, not able to say definitively. But this is the end of his life. And so he ends up dying. And with that in mind, I want you to go with me back to 2 Timothy. Because this is the final letter of Paul. And he saw this coming. Because he's been in chains. Because he's been in prison before and got out. And he knows how different this circumstance is. And so in 2 Timothy chapter 4, he writes to Timothy, whom he loves. And I'm going to back all the way up to verse 1. And look at the way he writes. Look at the things that are on his mind, the things that are on his heart. We spent this whole class trying to get to know Paul. Hopefully you feel like you know him and what was important to him a little bit more now than you did before. So here his final words to Timothy are, I solemnly charge you in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who is to judge the living and the dead, and by his appearing in his kingdom. Preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season. Reprove, rebuke, exhort with great patience and instruction. Time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but wanting to have their ears tickled, they will accumulate for themselves teachers in accordance to their own desire. Turn away their ears from the truth, turn aside to myths. But you, be sober in all things. Endure hardship. Do the work of an evangelist. Fulfill your ministry. For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith. In the future, there's laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing. When you consider all that he went through, and now as he sits in chains and likely dictating this to somebody else to write, or writing it in feeble candlelight himself, his message is preach the word. Just keep at it. He doesn't tell Timothy, you know what? Actually, at the end of my life, and after all I've gone through, and now look at how it's going to end up. I mean, the beheading's coming. He doesn't say, Timothy, take your foot off the gas. I really steered you wrong. You really ought to just be a little bit more conciliatory, get along with people a little bit more, maybe be a little less loud about preaching Jesus. No, he says. He says, sometimes they're not going to want to listen, and they're going to want to have their ears tickled. You just keep it. In season, out of season. Don't worry about it. And he looks at his life as one, and he tells Timothy, fulfill your ministry, which is kind of like him saying, what's Paul done? He's fulfilled his ministry. So now, Timothy, it's your turn. And really, that's the message of Paul. He did his job, and then he says, I'm going to go the way of all the earth, and guess what's left? You do your job. And that's Paul. And if you get that, I feel like, for me, I can't read him the same. Because you realize that everybody has a job. And someday, you're going to be done. And that will be the best day. And it will all be worth it. And then there will be another generation, and it's your job to say, hey, you fulfill your ministry. And he says, I've got a crown of righteousness. And he doesn't, by the way, vacillate on this. It's not like, oh, I hope maybe possibly I have a crown of righteousness. I do have it. Like, he knows it. He's confident. He has conviction. And he also has conviction that anybody else can have that conviction too. And so as we finish up the life of Paul, the life of Paul is a guy who started out hating Jesus, doing everything absolutely awful, and he could have spent his whole life feeling guilty and shameful once Jesus met him on that road. But instead, he got the word. He did something meaningful with his life, and he died more hopeful than he began. I just think it's a beautiful thing. So that's all I've got for you. Then we have any comments or thoughts before we close up?